With Labor Day upon us, there's no better time for us to think about our work than now. Labor Day was created to celebrate the contributions of Americans to the prosperity and even the well-being of our country. So in order to do that, in order to talk about work today, I want us to go back to a book that many of us maybe don't read, maybe are not as familiar with. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. And now the book of Ecclesiastes is a very different book. It doesn't read like other books. That doesn't mean it's inconsistent in any way. It's actually a pretty consistent book throughout. But a lot of people, when they read the book of Ecclesiastes, they come away feeling maybe a little bit hopeless. I always find you're more hopeful if you read it from the beginning to the end in one sitting. But you might read the first few chapters and come away a little hopeless. But the reason we're going to go to this book, Ecclesiastes, is for two reasons. Ecclesiastes is a good book simply because it addresses a lot of the tough issues of life. It addresses the issues of suffering. It addresses the issues of money, of power, of pleasure. It also talks about the tough questions about meaning, right, or purpose. Like, why am I here? Or what am I supposed to do with myself? What am I supposed to do here on this earth? So I love Ecclesiastes because it addresses a lot of those questions. And it even addresses this question about work. But I think the second thing, and the second reason why I like Ecclesiastes is because it teaches us that the only way to live life, the best way to live life, is with God at the center. Now, just a little introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. This was written by a guy named King Solomon. And King Solomon, he was the richest man in the world at his time. He was the wisest man in his time. He could get any pleasure that he wanted, whether it would be women or whether it be food, whatever you can think of, he had the power to get it. And he worked endlessly to build up a very powerful kingdom. But you see, when we look at King Solomon tells us that he went after all of these things. That he made all of these things the center of his life, and he came up empty. And that's what leads him to conclude that the best way to live life is to live life with God at the center. I always look at King Solomon sort of as this climbing this ladder of success, this ladder of work, this ladder of pleasure, this ladder of power, this ladder of money. He gets to the very top of it, gets all that he can of all of these things. And he has the grace for us to look back down to us and to tell us there's nothing to be found up there. That for all the striving that we do here on earth to get as much money as we can, to all the pleasures that we can, to get all the power or position that we can, or the wisdom and knowledge that we can, or work all we can, that there's ultimately nothing to be gained from all of that striving. So again, it leads him to conclude that the best way to live life is to live life with God at the center of it all. And I love that he actually talks about work. And that's something that we can all relate to. Many of us work. But have we really thought about why it is that we actually work? Like, I don't know if we have actually taken that question seriously or thought about it honestly, to think about reasons why we actually get up every day and work. Now, the reason why I don't think we've really thought about it is because I think we kind of treat it like breathing. It's just something we're supposed to do, something we naturally do. Right? I'm not thinking about my breathing right now. And as you're watching this video, you're not thinking about your breathing or blinking or anything like that. Your body just does it. So I think it's the same thing with work. Is that we sort of just think that, okay, well, I go to school for however many years, 12 years in high school, elementary school, middle school, high school, and then maybe I go to college, or maybe I go to a trade school, or maybe I just go an apprentice somewhere and I learn a trade of some sort, and then I work. I think we just think it's just something we just do. But if we're honest, right, we got to really think about this question. Right? Maybe we haven't thought about it. But why is it that we actually work? Now, I think there's a lot of reasons why we work. Probably a lot of reasons that maybe a lot of these reasons are reasons you have for why you work. Maybe there's more reasons than what I'm going to give here. But I think it's pretty much all the same with a lot of us, of why it is that we work. Now, I think a lot of us work simply for money. And that's not totally a bad thing, but that seems to be a driving force behind a lot of people in why it is that they actually work, or the reason why they go into a certain profession. There was a poll done some years ago, and I'm going to read the figures here for you so I don't get them incorrect. But in this survey, it was all about work. They said that 63% of people are not engaged in their job. 24% actively hate their job. 13% are actively engaged at work. And what that means is that there's 87% that either hate their job or don't want to engage in it. So it makes me think that perhaps people really just go to the job or do their work just for the money. Now, maybe, and I think it's a good reason, and maybe it is for you as well. But again, working for money is not a bad thing, because we need it for bills, we need it for loans, we need it for debts that we have, we need it to put food on the table. So that's not a bad reason to work. But that might be one of the reasons why we do it. Another reason that we work is simply for accomplishment or success. If you're the type of person that is in a sales position, you have some kind of sales job, maybe at a car dealership, or maybe you sell products of some sort. If you're in that kind of position, it takes a particular person to want to work in sales. I'm not a salesperson. I would be terrible at it. I have a hard time just trying to get somebody to do something or get somebody to buy something I'm offering. Right? I'm not that kind of person. But maybe that describes you. If you're a salesperson, there are quotas you have to meet. And when you meet those quotas, you have this sense of accomplishment. You have this sense of success. Right? So maybe that's a reason why you work. Other people work just for a sense of permanence, meaning that they are trying to build up something they're going to leave behind. That they would love to leave something behind for their kids, or maybe some other relatives. So they're trying to build a better future, not just for themselves, but build a better future for anybody else who's going to be left behind when they leave this earth. But what's interesting, though, is I think some people, when they are so built on this idea of permanence, is that they almost try to build up all of this wealth. They try to accumulate all this wealth, almost as if they're going to be able to take this to the grave with them, or take this even to the afterlife with them. If you're familiar with history, Egyptians did this all the time. At least Egyptian pharaohs did. The pharaohs would be buried with some of their treasures, their most prized possessions, and with the belief that they were going to take some of this stuff with them into the afterlife. But if you go and unearth these tombs, you find that that stuff is actually still there. Now, I think another reason, if we think deep down, I think one of the reasons why, and maybe this is the main reason that we work is to have some sort of control over life. Think about it. When you work, you're able to control how much money you get. Right? Especially if you're in a sales position, you just get more clients, you sell more things, you get more money, you're able to go on vacations, you're able to buy all these nice things, right? So you're able to control life to some extent. And then for others, they're trying to control what they're going to leave behind. So again, it kind of goes with that idea of permanence, trying to control what we leave. But what happens, right, when things happen in our job or in our work, things that are out of our control, things that aren't our fault? Yes, sometimes, you're at work and maybe you're not doing a good job, you get let go. That was in your control. But there are things you can't control about work. Maybe the company you're working for, goes upside down, or they go bankrupt. They start laying off people. And so you are a victim of that. Or we look at our current time right now. We look at this virus that is plaguing our country. There are businesses that are closing. There are people who started their business before this virus hit, and now they are even more in debt because the business they tried to open can't open. So it was something out of their control. The work that they were doing that they thought they had a lot of control over, they no longer have that control anymore, because things outside of their control happened to them. Now, this has happened a few times in our family life. When we lived in Montana, there was a job that Lauren had got when we got there, and it was a blessing to us because we didn't know she was going to get that job or a job, and I wanted her to have a job when we got there, and God answered that prayer. But Lauren's job was a grant position, meaning that the school didn't have the budget, that it was approved by the powers that be of higher education in Montana. And so it came time, I think a year later, or maybe it might have been a couple years later, where the Board of Regents there was going to vote on whether or not she was going to be able to keep her job. Now, there were some rumblings or some rumors that maybe that wasn't going to happen. Her job wasn't going to get approved, and she was going to be out of the job. Again, this is out of her control. But thankfully, they voted yes for that to happen, and she got the job. She got to keep the job. But then we moved here to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and my wife works at Western Kentucky University, and while she was there, WKU went through some budget cuts, and she was one of the people that was let go during that time. Now, thankfully, just a few months later, her boss called her back and offered her another job, and we were thankful that God provided for us in that time, but we can relate with people, right, who are in that moment where they're having to sort of have this anxiety, this frustration over the fact that they thought they control their work. They thought they could control their work. But things happen that are out of their control, so they end up losing their job. Maybe they get a pay cut. So all of us have felt those feelings at some point or another. We think we can control our work, but then things happen. And we're now frustrated. We're now anxious because our job is lost. Our job is on the line. So sometimes maybe we don't even know what to do. Now, what Solomon's going to do, he's going to show us maybe the reality of work. And here's what he says. Here's how he begins his sort of speech or his little talk on work. And here's what he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 17. He says, "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun," and this is just everything on earth, so under the sun is that his saying for everything on earth, "under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." So he's wrestling with this idea of work. And that's an idea that we're all wrestling with as well. Because a lot of us are in this endless cycle of work. We all have to work. Right? In order to make money, you actually have to work. But that reality doesn't do away with the fact that there are certain feelings that we have, maybe similar to what King Solomon has, to our having to work. Maybe we just think the work that we're doing is just terrible. Simply because maybe our boss is not that great, or maybe we look at the coworkers who aren't doing their jobs, or simply the work is hard. Maybe there are quotas you have to meet, and you struggle every month to meet those quotas just because there's no business. There are no people to sell to. So maybe it's hard, or maybe you have a job where you got to work outside all the time. You got to work in a factory all the time. You're always in the heat. You're always sweating. And so it's physically, mentally, emotionally difficult. But the fact that we are all frustrated, the fact that we're all anxious about our work, or we're wrestling or struggling with this idea of work, I think points to that deep desire we all have for fulfillment, for contentment, for something that only God can provide in us. And there's that deep desire in us that there's more to life than what we see here on earth. A completely different perspective. That there's got to be more to this life than just this endless cycle of work. That we go to sleep early so we can wake up, go to work, come back home, go to sleep, wake up the next day, go to work, and that cycle just keeps going on and on and on and on. There's got to be more to life than just this endless cycle that we have. And so what else does Solomon say about this idea of work? And he goes on after this verse that we've just read, and I'll read it again. You turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 17 through 26. Here's what he says. "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And so we read Solomon's words and we hear from the very beginning that he hated life because of all the work he has to do. But for Solomon, the greatest injustice about having to work was the fact that he's going to do all this work and he's going to have to leave it there for somebody else when he dies. He doesn't know if the person he leaves it to is going to be wise or foolish with their inheritance. And the other misfortune for him, or the other injustice for him, is that he's going to do all this work and give it to somebody who has not worked for it. And I think this was probably a right fear that he had, rightfully so. He had this fear. You know, his son goes by the name of Rehoboam. You can go read the story in 1 Kings chapter 12. And in that story, we find that Rehoboam, Solomon's son, actually acted very foolishly with the kingdom and ended up causing a disagreement that was going to last for many, many years. Right? So he really broke up the kingdom, right, because he acted foolishly. And so maybe Solomon saw that was going to happen. Maybe he knew that was coming, and that's why he writes this. You know, because he knew his son wasn't going to be wise with the things that he was going to leave behind. And now maybe if we look at ourselves, look at our work, maybe that's not a fear of ours. Maybe it's not a fear of ours to think that, we're doing all this work and I'm going to have to leave it behind. Or I'm doing all this work and the person I'm leaving it behind to, I don't know if they're going to be wise or foolish with it, or I'm concerned that because they haven't worked for it, it's not fair for me to be able to leave it behind for them because they've never worked a day in their life. Maybe that's a fear that we have, but maybe it isn't. But I think what Solomon is doing here, right, what he tells us in chapter 2, verse 22, he says, "What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun?" Now, another way to say this might be like this. What price are you willing to pay for all the work you are or will be invested in? What consequences are you willing to go through or endure for success at work? People every day, when they are in this endless cycle of work, and all of us are a part of that. All of us are working right now. Right? People end up bearing some sort of consequence for making work the center of their life. And that's one thing I want to make clear, is that work is a good thing. But we twist that and we make it an ultimate thing for us. We make it the thing that defines who we are. We make it the thing that is the most important thing in our life. We work endless hours to accumulate wealth, to make a name for ourselves. But by doing that, we also endure some consequences because of that. A lot of us may have some constant frustration. With all the work that we're doing, we may be frustrated with our boss, who's too hard on us. We may be frustrated with other coworkers who are not doing their jobs, or maybe we're just frustrated with the job because we look at the job and it's not really getting us anywhere in life. So we're constantly frustrated. Now, in other times, we might experience some pain. And a lot of that pain is felt by other people around us. When we work endless hours, when all we think about is work, the people around us endure the consequence of pain. Because if you're married and you have kids, you're not spending any time with them, you're just invested in work, that relationship suffers. Other relationships that you have with your friends or other family members, those things suffer as well. Those people endure pain because they are no longer able to spend time with you because you're so busy in your work. And yet other people, they endure that consequence of insomnia. Maybe that describes you, where you're always thinking about work. There's nothing else you think about. And I know that's a hard thing. Especially if you have a job that is salaried, where it's not just a 40-hour week, it is you just work whenever get the job done. So maybe that might be some weeks you might be working 60 hours a week, or others you might work less, but many times you're working more hours throughout the week. And so it's hard to not take that work home with you. It's hard for you to quit thinking about work. And then when you go to sleep, you can't sleep because you're always thinking about deadlines that you have. You're always thinking about, maybe you're not going to have enough money this next month with all the work that you've been putting into the things that you're doing. And we know the lack of sleep is not just going to affect our work, it's going to affect our relationships, it's going to affect our health as well. So these are consequences that we face. And so we have all these consequences, and so why do we choose to still put ourselves through this endless cycle of work, where work is our ultimate goal, where work is the center of our lives? Why do we keep putting ourselves through that very thing? Do we do it for momentary success? Or do we do it for all the wealth we can accumulate, thinking that we can actually take this with us, or thinking that we can fully attain satisfaction or fulfillment in life if we just work endless hours? But here's what Solomon says. Solomon says in chapter 2, verses 23, here's what he says. He says, all their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. And so for Solomon, at least in the beginning part of this section here, work is not a good thing. Right? He sees all the pain. He sees all the hardship that it places on people. Now again, everybody has to work. Right? And that's how we make money, right? That you go out and you get a job. Everybody has to do that. But there's a big difference between that and making work the ultimate thing. Making work the thing that gives you value. Making work the thing that brings you ultimate fulfillment and contentment. That's what happens. We're unable to sleep. We're unable to rest. But I think what Solomon is wanting to do for us here, Solomon is wanting us to look at work in a very different way. He's wanting to give us a different perspective about work. And this is really where he brings God into the conversation. And here's what he tells us. He says in Ecclesiastes 2, 24 through 25, he says, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? So he's offering us a different view of work. He's showing us that work in its proper place will bring some sort of purpose, will bring some sort of contentment or fulfillment in life, but it's not the thing that is going to bring you ultimate fulfillment or ultimate contentment. Work was always meant to be viewed with God in mind. And that's why he says it here. And without God, you cannot find enjoyment in life. You cannot find enjoyment in the toil that we're doing, that endless cycle of work. You're not going to find enjoyment in it if work is at the center of your life. God has to be a part of this very thing. Because when work becomes the ultimate thing in life, when your work becomes the thing that is the only thing you're seeking after in this life, it becomes the thing that you find fulfillment in. Meaning that it defines who you are. It gives you value and it takes value away. For instance, if you have a good day at work, Your sales are doing great, or you're getting a lot more customers or patients or whatever the case might be, and you have a good day, right? Your emotions are high. But then the days that maybe things don't go so well, that affects the way that you maybe look at yourself. It affects the way that you then communicate with other people, the way you treat your family. And so work, when it's the ultimate thing in life, right, it becomes that thing we find fulfillment in, and it defines everything about who we are, for good and a lot of times for bad. And so again, if we seek after that as ultimate fulfillment without God, right, we're going to find ourselves in a really huge mess. Now, the second reason is that without God, when work becomes the ultimate thing, it becomes the thing that we try to guarantee our future with. Now, think about that. We all imagine having a better life. We all want to build up for ourselves a better future. But see, the reality is we don't have control over everything. We might think that we have some control over the work that we do, that we have some control over some of the things that we can leave behind. But ultimately, things that happen at our job, it's completely out of our control. We look at the virus here in 2020, case in point. Nobody knew that was going to happen, and it happens, and a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people are having to change the way they do business. A lot of people are having to change the way that they do work. So, we can't control it. And I think another point to this too is that I think when we try to guarantee our future with our work, and again, it's not a bad thing to build up an inheritance. So hopefully you're not hearing that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do that, but if that's the only thing you're seeking after, that's a totally different question or different thing altogether. But I think another point to this is that I think when we try to guarantee our future with work or with money, I think a lot of what we're doing, or a lot of what we're saying to God, is that God, you're not doing this for me. You're not doing this in my life. So I'm going to do it myself. When you feel like you're in a job that maybe pays enough for you to get through life, but you want more, and so you go out and you try to find another, a much better job, and you're trying to accumulate this more wealth for you because you think, well, God's not going to do it for me, right? Or God is not going to provide for me, so I need to do it myself. So again, don't mishear what I'm saying. It's okay to go get a better job. It's okay to want to make more money. But again, what is the motivation behind that? Is it really something against God, that God's not doing something for you, so you need to be able to do that? You're unsure of your future, right? Because maybe you don't trust God. And so you try to build things up for yourself in an attempt to guarantee a future for yourself. Now, work. We've talked a lot about work here today. And work is a good thing. Work is something that we can find joy in. I mean, we look all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. We look to Genesis chapter 1 through 2. And we know when God worked, when God created the world, that God, after everything He created, He said it was good. And then He gets to humanity and He says it was very good. So in all of that, He found joy in creating the big things of our universe and our world, but even the little things, creating us, creating humanity. Right? So there is joy to be found in work. So God wants us to be able to have that joy. Solomon, I think, here is telling us that we can have that joy as well, as long as we're placing God at the center and not work at the center of our lives. But I think sometimes God's going to have to do that in us. Sometimes this is a work that God is going to have to do in us to find this joy in our work. I think when we look at our work, I think a lot of us can get to a point where maybe we just don't see a purpose to it. Maybe we don't see any meaning behind all of it all. Because maybe we do identify with what I said earlier, is that we're just sort of stuck in this endless cycle of work. No rhyme or reason. We're just in it because we have to. And we struggle, we're frustrated, we're anxious because we can't find any purpose in it. What's interesting is that Solomon, throughout this passage here, he uses that term or that phrase. He says, "This too is meaningless." Now, if you read the whole book, you find that Solomon wasn't meaning that in the sense that we might think. That he wasn't saying that all of this really is meaningless. That it actually, at the end of the book, the way he concludes it, is that actually everything that we do actually means a whole lot. And I think that's a perspective change that Solomon's wanting us to have. Solomon has this perspective of under the sun, right? He's looking at just how this world is working, and the way it works, there's a lot of pain in the toil that we're having to do. There's a lot of frustration and anxiety that the work that we're having to do brings upon us. But yet, when we have a different perspective, when we have a above the sun perspective, when we have a heavenly sort of perspective, a God perspective, we see that all of this actually does matter. That what we do at our jobs matters a whole lot. How diligent we are in our work actually matters a whole lot. Because the way Solomon concludes his book, he says that everybody is basically going to be accountable for the things that they've done, the way they've used the resources that God has given them. So the way we treat our work is important. The way we view our work is important. But we're unable to look at it rightly, to treat it correctly, unless we have God. Like God has to be at the center of our lives, right? In order for us to find that joy in our work. But what we have to do is we have to know that work has its place in our life. We can't place it as the ultimate thing in our life. We can't place it on the priority list as number one, where God should be. If we place God at the very top of our priority list, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to feel anxious or feel frustrated at some points in your life. But you see a greater purpose to your work. You see a greater purpose to all the toil that you're having to endure in this life. That it is not meaningless. That actually at the end of life, it does mean a whole lot. It does matter. And so Solomon tells us, and he's done this with everything else. And because he was the guy who was the richest man in his time. He could have any pleasure he wanted. He could have any woman he wanted. He had all the wisdom and knowledge that anybody could have. The most power, right? The highest position in the land. And he tells us that when we put those things at the center of our lives, we're always going to come up empty. We're never going to be fulfilled. We're never going to be content. And a lot of us are doing that with work. A lot of us are always thinking about work. We always want to be fully immersed in our work. And not just so we can get the job done, but because that's our life. But Solomon warns us. And I think it's a great thing that he's gone before us to do that. He warns us and tells us that you're going to do all this striving. You're going to fight in your life just to work all the time. And at the end of it all, you're going to be empty. So the best way to live life, again, he's not saying don't care about your work. He's saying that the top priority in life needs to be God. God needs to be the center of your life. And your work, yes, should be on that priority list. But the best way to enjoy our work, the best way to have a good perspective on our work is with God at the center of our lives. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for how you love us, how you care for us, how you show us the way to live this life. We're thankful, Lord, that you sent someone like King Solomon, who has made all these mistakes in his life and is able to show us and tell us that there's nothing to be found in making the very same mistakes that he has. And specifically with what we're talking about today, with work. Solomon made that mistake of making work the top priority in his life and endured a lot of consequences and a lot of pain because of it. And so, Lord, I pray for all of us, Lord, who are anxious or frustrated with our jobs. I pray that we wouldn't keep work at the center of our life. Yes, it's important to us. Yes, it's what puts food on the table. But it can't be the ultimate thing in life. It can't be the thing that we find fulfillment and contentment in. Because like Solomon tells us, we are going to come up empty. So I pray, Lord, instead of putting work at the center, that we would instead put you at the center of our life. Looking to you as the one who can bring us ultimate fulfillment, ultimate contentment in life. And that it is only through you that we can actually find enjoyment in all this work that we have to do. So I pray that we turn to you, that we wouldn't keep striving here on our own, but we would look to you as the ultimate thing in our life. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.